There is a moment in every wealth-building journey that almost nobody recognizes while it's happening. A moment where the entire dynamic shifts, where effort begins to matter less and positioning begins to matter more, where your income is no longer the primary driver of your financial progress and something else quietly takes over. Most people never reach this moment. Not because it's reserved for a select few, not because it requires extraordinary intelligence or luck, but because they abandon the process before the shift occurs. They exit too early. They interrupt the system. They misinterpret the silence of early progress as failure. And in doing so, they disqualify themselves from ever experiencing the phase where wealth begins to accelerate. Because there is a transition point in compounding that changes everything. And once you cross it, your relationship with money is never the same again. In the beginning, everything feels manual. Every dollar saved requires discipline. Every contribution feels like a sacrifice. Progress is slow, sometimes painfully slow. You check your accounts and see incremental movement. Small increases that don't feel proportional to the effort you're putting in. And this is where most people begin to question the process. They start to wonder if it's even working, if the strategy is effective, if they should be doing something different, something faster, something more aggressive. Because the early phase of wealth building does not reward you emotionally. It tests you. It stretches your patience. It forces you to operate without validation. And for a mind conditioned to expect immediate results, that's an uncomfortable place to stay. But what's actually happening during this phase is far more important than it appears. You are not just accumulating money. You are constructing a base, a foundation that future growth will rely on. And foundations are rarely exciting. They are not visible. They do not produce immediate results. But without them, nothing substantial can be built. The problem is, most people abandon the foundation stage because it feels unproductive. They mistake invisibility for ineffectiveness. And in doing so, they reset the process over and over again, never allowing it to mature. Then comes the middle phase. This is where things become dangerous. Not because progress stops, but because progress becomes deceptive. Your account begins to grow at a slightly faster pace, but not fast enough to feel transformative. You're no longer at the very beginning, but you're not yet experiencing exponential growth. You're in between. And this in-between phase is where most wealth-building efforts collapse. Because this is where boredom sets in, where consistency becomes routine, where the novelty disappears. And without novelty, the brain starts searching for alternatives, new strategies, new opportunities, new ways to accelerate the process. This is where people begin to interfere. They start adjusting things unnecessarily, switching investments, pausing contributions, chasing trends, trying to optimize what doesn't need optimization. And every adjustment, every interruption, delays the moment they're trying to reach. Because the transition point, the moment your money begins working harder than you, requires uninterrupted time. It requires continuity. And most importantly, it requires restraint. The discipline to not interfere when nothing seems to be happening. The patience to continue when progress feels ordinary. The confidence to stay consistent when others are chasing shortcuts. Then, gradually, almost imperceptibly, the shift begins. Your contributions still matter, but they no longer feel like the primary driver of growth. Something else starts to emerge. Your existing capital begins generating noticeable returns. Returns that start to rival your contributions, then match them, and eventually surpass them. And this is the moment. The exact moment your money starts working harder than you. It doesn't arrive with an announcement. There is no notification, no clear signal that says you've made it. Instead, you notice it in hindsight. When you look at your account and realize that the growth you experienced did not come primarily from what you added, but from what was already there. That realization is subtle, but powerful, because it marks a complete shift in how wealth is created. At this point, your role begins to change. You are no longer the sole contributor to your financial progress. You become a supporter of a system that is now generating its own momentum. Your job is no longer to build from zero. It is to maintain and protect what has been built. To continue feeding the system without disrupting its function. But here's the critical part most people misunderstand. Reaching this phase does not mean you can relax. It means the stakes have increased. Because now, any disruption has a greater impact. Any withdrawal, any pause, any emotional decision affects a much larger base, which means the consequences are amplified. This is why discipline becomes even more important as your wealth grows, not less. There is also a psychological shift that occurs at this stage. For the first time, you begin to trust the process. Not because someone told you it works, but because you've experienced it. You've seen the transition. You've felt the acceleration. And that experience changes how you think, how you behave, how you make decisions. Because now, you are no longer relying on belief. You are operating from evidence. And this is where separation happens, between those who build lasting wealth and those who remain stuck in cycles of starting and stopping. Because once you've experienced true compounding, you stop looking for alternatives. You stop chasing quick wins. You stop being distracted by noise. Because nothing compares to the efficiency of a system that builds itself. But again, most people never reach this point. Not because it's difficult to understand, but because it's difficult to endure. It requires you to operate in a way that feels unnatural, to prioritize long-term outcomes over short-term satisfaction, to remain consistent in the absence of excitement, to trust a process that doesn't immediately reward you. And that combination is rare. So the question becomes, how do you ensure that you actually reach this moment? How do you position yourself to experience the phase where your money begins working harder than you? First, you maximize consistency. Not perfection, not intensity, consistency. Because compounding does not require you to be perfect. It requires you to continue. Even when it's inconvenient. Even when it's boring. Even when it feels insignificant. Second, you eliminate unnecessary decisions. Automation is not just a convenience. It is a strategy. Because every decision you remove is one less opportunity to disrupt the process. Third, you increase contributions over time. Gradually. Strategically. Ensuring that your input continues to grow alongside your income, without allowing lifestyle expansion to absorb the difference. Fourth, you minimize interference. This includes emotional reactions, market timing, constant adjustments. Because interference is the fastest way to delay the transition point. And finally, you extend your time horizon, because the entire system depends on time. Not days, not months, years, decades. That is the scale where compounding becomes undeniable. If you follow this path, if you remain consistent long enough, you will reach that moment. The moment where your effort is no longer the primary driver, where your system takes over, where growth begins to accelerate. And when that happens, everything changes. Because at that point, you are no longer working for money. Money is working for you. If this changed the way you think about wealth, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Smart Money Compounds. Because here, we don't just chase income. We build systems that eventually replace it.